if someone asks you, like, basically, who is ISIS? Who are these guys that we're now having to deal with?
Well, it's a core of Iraqis and Syrians, but they have, according to U.S. intelligence, almost 10,000 foreign fighters from a total of 50 different countries, including ours. So it is a multinational sort of, diaspora of terrorists. And they really are terrorists, as we've seen this week, in incredibly brutal and tragic form. Their immediate goal is to rule over as much of Iraq and Syria as they can. And we saw them showing their ambition of ruling Kurdistan, which is an area where Arabs haven't historically ruled. Kurdistan is Kurds, and that's a different ethnic group. So the idea that they wanted to extend over there until American airstrikes helped push them back shows their ambition. They say they want to have a caliphate, which means a fundamentalist, old-fashioned Islamic theocracy, the kind the Taliban had in Afghanistan. Some people would say that was all they wanted to do, was create it right there in Iraq and Syria. But others would say no, any caliphate, by definition, wants to recreate rule over all Muslims and all places where Muslims used to rule, including, for example, southern Spain. And we've occasionally seen ISIS affiliates or members talk about their ambitions in that direction. Then it gets to the issue of what tactics would they use against us. And of course, there's ongoing debate here. But any kind of a group like this in the past, with this kind of ideology, has decided ultimately to attack us, as we all know too well. And the reason being, we're supposedly propping up the Saudi monarchy that, in their mind, in the mind of this ISIL group, abuses the Mecca and Medina shrines in Saudi Arabia. We supposedly support the Zionist Israelis, who have a Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East, and all these other sins which make it necessary to attack us because we're supporting their local enemies. Leave aside whether they really care about hurting us back here, they see us as supporting and propping up their local rivals. So by that logic, it becomes almost inevitable that this kind of a group would seek to attack us. And that's unfortunately, as we know, been the pattern with Al-Qaeda Central, with Al-Qaeda in Yemen, with the various Taliban-inspired groups in Pakistan that did the Times Square attempt. So almost all of these groups have ultimately seen fit to try to attack the American homeland as well. But there's still ongoing debate about how central that would be to ISIL's ideology.
I guess Mike Morell, or someone, former CIA, was on CBS this morning saying he would not be surprised if one of these guys shows up at a mall in the U.S. with an AK-47 and starts killing people. Do we need to worry about that?
I'm afraid we do need to worry about that, but sometimes with U.S. intelligence, and I have a great deal of respect for Mike Morell, and he's right to raise the possibility. Sometimes U.S. intelligence prefers to raise possibilities verbally in advance so they're not proven wrong or negligent later, and that's especially part of the culture after 9/11, which of course they didn't anticipate. I remember back to when the FBI director, shortly after 9/11, used to say he thought it was inevitable there would be Israel-style attacks, of the type that various Palestinian groups would carry out against Israel in the United States. Mall shootings, restaurant shootings, even highway bombings, and they didn't happen. At least they didn't happen yet from Al-Qaeda. So sometimes these officials will want to err on the side of caution. But the downside, of course, is that you're almost giving the terrorists credit for something that they may want to pull off. And if they get the psychological benefit of having done it without even bothering to do the attack, you're conceding too much. And so the likelihood of any American mall being a place that gets hit by one of these guys, rather than just an American crazed gunman of the type we occasionally generate in our own midst, I think is a pretty low probability right now.
So not to worry about that. And the fact that these might be Brits. I think I heard today where they're thinking the person who beheaded Jim Foley was perhaps British. That's kind of a weird, maybe of a Muslim, Arab background, but a Westerner in a sense.
Well, there are probably a few thousand European and American jihadists fighting in Syria or Iraq now on behalf of this group or its affiliates. And of course what they can do is take a flight to Spain or Greece or Turkey and then just sneak over the border, which is obviously unregulated, at least on the Syrian or Iraqi side. And of course their passports are never stamped, which means when they want to come back, there's no proof that they were doing these things in these countries, so we're potentially vulnerable if we don't manage to nab them at the border or figure out some other way to prove what they were up to. And that's where a lot of the concern has arisen as well, partly by people being inspired here, by the fighters over there through social media or what have you, or fighters from Syria and Iraq coming back to the United States or Britain or where have you later on. I'm afraid that is a risk, and we're going to have to live with that risk. The good news is that, you know, if some 24-year-old shows up in Turkey with a passport and he doesn't have any proof of what he was doing, where he was, any job he might have held, and then he reappears on the scene a year and a half later, intelligence has some reason to be suspicious. So we can get some clues and try to track these people. Problem is we also owe them due process because they're American citizens, British citizens, so we can't just put them in some detention facility. All we can do is try to be attentive. So you're going to have this kind of concern, I'm afraid, for a number of years going forward.
Is it alarming that apparently what I've read is that some members of Al-Qaeda don't want anything to do with these guys? Is it because they're especially brutal, vicious people, or because their theology and philosophy and ideology is different?
I think they are similar to Al-Qaeda in their core beliefs. I think there have been disputes over tactics, and I think they were to some extent expelled, or some of their precursor groups were expelled because of their brutality. On the other hand, part of what they're doing in Iraq right now, I'm afraid, is being a little more clever. And while they've gone after this Yazidi group and some others with reckless abandon, to some extent they've tried to make their peace with the mainstream Sunni Arab tribes, when in theory they should be trying to kill them too, because those are cigarette smoking, movie watching, you know, infidels, according to a pure interpretation of 7th century Takfiri Islam of the type that these people pervert. I'm not saying that any legitimate form of Islam would condone what they're doing, but their own mind persuades them that this is appropriate, and therefore they really, in some sense, should not be natural allies with a lot of the Sunni Arabs in Iraq, many of whom are rather secular. But they figured out that they better dampen down and hide their differences for now to get allies and to get a foothold in these areas of the north and west of the country. So in the end, I think they are extremely brutal, and they probably will do more of what we've tragically seen this week. But they're also tactically savvy enough to know they've got to pick their battles carefully.
At the risk of what, pissing off people over there? Like more isolating themselves over there, as opposed to like making us mad. They don't care if we get mad.
Right.
Beheading an American journalist, right?
That's right. I think that what they're really trying to do is to gain a following, and they've had some success, I'm afraid to say. I talked to an American intelligence official recently who said these guys are so much better at propaganda and at communication and at recruiting than Al-Qaeda Central ever was. And if you think about the human psychology, a lot of us are, whether we like to admit it or not, whether it's controlled or not in a given case, attracted to death, to violence. There's something about the human psyche, and most of us can regulate that. But if you can somehow dramatize that, work it into a narrative of martyrdom and a narrative of fighting against common enemies, and make it sound charismatic and appealing and sexy even, you can win some followers. And they're better at that, apparently, than Al-Qaeda Central ever was. And that's why a fair amount of American intelligence is worried. This isn't just 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people who've got this warped view and are trying to, you know, bring along as many others as they can. They're recruiting, and they're growing. And even though I don't think they're ever going to reach the mainstream Sunni Arab tribes, for example, they're probably going to have tens of thousands of followers if they don't already. And that's one more reason we have to take this group very seriously.
Is the only way to combat them is to attack them from the air, to kill them? There's no working with them. There's no having to, because they're not a state government. They're a terrorist organization. But how do you deal with that? A growing thousands, tens of, you know, how do we, to protect our interests here and there, deal with that?
I think you have to break it down in your mind in categories. There are the hardcore believers, just like with the Taliban in Afghanistan or whatever, and they are part of the ruling center core. They have blood on their hands. It's hard to imagine ever doing a deal with them. You never know, but you don't really want to count on it, and you certainly don't want to offer them concessions. Any deal would have to be once they got tired of the fight or convinced they were going to lose anyway. That's one extreme. The other extreme is the people who are just currently working with this group because they're so angry at former Prime Minister Maliki or at President Assad of Syria or whatever, and they just sense that here's an opportunity to oppose a common enemy, and so it's an alliance of convenience. You'd like to try to persuade some of those people to break with ISIS and come back to a more reasonable position. Then there's that middle ground, the people who maybe are feeling at the moment like they really believe in this group, but they haven't yet killed anybody themselves. they may still be able to change their mind again. And that's where the tactics and the strategy get a little bit complicated, because what you'd like to do is sort of persuade some of those people that never really were interested in this group in the first place, and not necessarily have a permanent fight with them. Because once you start pursuing justice to that extreme, you're probably just prolonging the conflict. And so you'd want to, at some point, have a path for that sort of soft supporter to disengage. And that's the kind of thing we've been trying to work through in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places over the last dozen years already. So we have some experience in trying to distinguish one group from another.
Maybe I'm naive, but I found it extraordinary that President Obama, in the middle of his vacation, would come out and speak to what happened to this Jim Foley, a freelance journalist, not well known really outside the circle of people who cared about him and the fact that he had been taken hostage. He came out and was fairly forceful in his condemnation of ISIL. But it's also clear he's not going to change policy because they behead one journalist, or if they behead another or another. And he shouldn't. Is that right? I mean, we shouldn't be intimidated or allow what a terrorist group does affect how we respond. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that President Obama, not only in speaking about the tragedy of the killing of Mr. Foley, but also in having his White House later explain that we tried to rescue them and that there may have been even some offers of this ransom, that we are thinking about this in a very serious way. And it's not over yet. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And so part of it is a preparation psychologically of the country for what still could be coming. Another part of it is to explain to Americans why, to put it bluntly, Mr. Obama's 2012 narrative is no longer applicable. The narrative of ending 2 wars on his watch. This is no longer, you know, there may still be people in the administration who occasionally say it. I don't think we're going to hear that much about it from the president any longer, because whether we would have liked this war to be over or not, whether we ever should have been part of it or not, you can debate. It's not over. And it's not even over anymore for us. And Mr. Obama now is bracing the nation for, call it what you will, phase 2 or 3 or 4 of the war on terror. And frankly, I think we all are going to have to get ready. I'm not saying we're going to have another big war like Iraq or Afghanistan, but any thinking we had that this war on terror was on the way out, which is some of what you heard from the administration in 2012. I'm not trying to be critical, because at that point you could make the case. You can't make that case anymore, and Mr. Obama is aware of it. And so he's preparing the country for what's to come.
Last thing, very minor thing, but if you see the acronym, it's ISIS, I-S-I-S. But you and the president several times called it ISIL. This is something we're going to have to get to know and deal with. What's the difference? Why ISIL as opposed to ISIS? And I'm just curious.
Well, there really isn't a difference, except that now they also want to call themselves IS, which means simply the Islamic State, which tells you about their ambitions. Because the ISIS, the ISIL, that has to do with geographic specificity. So the I's, apart from the Islamic State part, will stand for Iraq. The S or the L stands for the Levant, or for Syria, or for an Arabic name for Syria. And so they're being geographically specific that their original origin and focus was Syria and Iraq. But as they now establish themselves in those 2 countries and have ambitions, starting with Kurdistan in Iraq, but even perhaps more broadly, they want to call themselves the Caliphate, the Islamic State. And that gives you a feel for how big their ambitions may be. This kind of a group, with the ideology it has, there's no way it can forever tolerate the Saudi monarchy, for example. If they had their way, if they had enough power, there's no way they could let that group stay in power. I mean, there's no way that they would tolerate it. It's just inconsistent with their worldview of who should be in control of Islam's greatest shrines. Also, there's no way, greatest mosques. There's no way that they would tolerate Israel. You know, they make Hamas look moderate, because Israel is infidels in the Middle East, in the Arab and Muslim heartland. So IS is a giveaway. It's a giveaway that their ambitions are big, and we're going to have to fight them at some point, you know, and probably the sooner the better.